No, I don't know why I couldn't that one time.
Do you want me to, oh,
That's okay, go ahead, call Morris John.
You're the vice chair.
Carolyn, well, I will stand
Figuring out the
by
responsibility.
if you ever need me to do it.
Good afternoon, Senate institutions, here today on Wednesday, January 17th. We have the pleasure of having, Chief Recovering Officer, from the Agency of Administration, Doug Farnman, today to talk about what his efforts are, producing, and, we'll get right into it, sir. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did send a deck and a short summary of financial information, I believe.
They're both on the webpage and I have the deck of lined up if you want me to show it.
Okay. It probably couldn't hurt to have the deck up, but I was hoping to have just a more open-ended discussion with the committee, make sure you're able to ask any questions you want to ask, go in any direction you want to go with that. It's funny, I was reflecting the other day on whether or not this could be categorized as the largest disaster in the history of Vermont. When I say this, I mean the summer flood events of from the 7th to the 21st, as FEMA defines it. I look at it actually as the 7th to August 5th, but they broke us up into two separate disasters there because there was a brief pause in the rain, even though the rivers didn't go down. And I don't have the data to say that because I don't actually know how I would inflate the damages from the 1927 flood and find all the records related to. But I think the 1927 flood is the closest parallel that we have. If you compare the event from July to Tropical Storm Irene, and just in terms of overall monetary damage, we had 216 million of public assistance claims in Tropical Storm Irene. Even if you inflate that to today's dollars, that's $293. Now, this committee in particular knows that construction costs have inflated more than the general rate of inflation, right?
Right.
So you scale that up to 350 million, 400 million of today's dollars. We're at 620 million.
Yeah.
And that's without counting federal highways. Federal highways, and that FEMA public assistance number didn't count highways either. But federal highways, our damage there is estimated at $150 million right now as well. So with public infrastructure damage between the FEMA side and the federal highway side, we're at $770 million right now. On the FEMA side, yes.
what were those two numbers again? The FEMA was 6 something?
Our total damage estimate right now is 620 million for FEMA and 150 million for federal highways.
Thank you.
And that 620, right now, we're estimating about $49 to $50 million of insurance will come in, which will bring that down to 570. However, we haven't finished litigating how much it costs to do certain repairs or required mitigation in FEMA. So that 620 of total damage could increase as well. So we're estimating needing match for $570 million worth of FEMA damage right now. And that could fluctuate one way or another depending on what FEMA approves.
Is it, fair to say that the match that we require would be between 10 and 20%?
Yes, so at 111 or 112 million, I apologize, I don't have the number memorized, although I should by now. It just changed because of the federal fiscal year. But at a certain threshold, which is in the low 100 millions, 111 or 112, we go from the 25% cost share to the 10% cost share. And with our total damage estimates over 600 million, we anticipate that will happen. Now, FEMA isn't 100% required to go from 75 to 90. But administratively, it's a rule process where they can go to 90% once that happens. I would be extremely surprised if they don't go to 90%. I don't think they've, chosen not to do that in the past. It's not 100% guaranteed until it has already happened with FEMA though. So we do, and we were hoping to cross that threshold before town meeting day to give towns a little bit more certainty. Unfortunately, with the way negotiating the projects and the damage and how we assess it is going back and forth with FEMA, we don't think we're going to cross that threshold in time for town meeting day. But we are continuing to work to cross it as quickly as it can without making concessions to FEMA, because it's not an absolute rule, but whenever you have a conversation quickly, you're more likely to, you know, to give up points that you don't want to see. And we're trying to make sure that, particularly with the cost to repair and mitigate the Capitol complex up to flood regulations, so that this does not happen again. Just like with Waterbury, that building was surrounded and there was like $200 or less damage.
That's nice.
I mean, expensive project, but very worth it
Right,
in the long run.
right, right.
So to protect our Capitol complex, you know, it's roughly double the scale of the Waterbury project.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mostly in the mechanicals and,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a large part of it. And I've overused this one, but, just to be fair, I'm share it with you as well. In touring the 133 State Street, I worked in that building for a decade. Beautiful building, marble, you know, nice bathrooms. It's just old National Life headquarters. It's a very nice place to work. I was very grateful to work there. And, but when you go down into the basement, away from the working area of the basement, it's all finished, and you go into the mechanical rooms. The mechanical rooms go down and down and down. And I felt like I was going into like a Batman villain's hideout.
Yeah,
It was really startling to me how much was in that basement.
yeah,
And how expensive it all looked.
yeah.
There was walls of computer equipment, and it was really startling to see it. You know, you take it for granted when you're in your office and it's temperature controlled and, you know, which is an obligation we have under the contract to keep our employees, you know, with healthy air and comfort. So, but it was much more extensive and expensive than I had ever thought it would be.
I was in that building when they were still pumping out water. And then, I was back in there after, well, they were about halfway cleaned up. And then I was in there after Serpro had left. And, yeah, just that right there, just seeing what they did at that point in time. Never mind all what would have to be replaced. It was just, it's unbelievable, one building. I mean, just the amount of work that was there. Yeah.
So similar to after Irene, BGS is working on working with FEMA to identify what FEMA is willing to pay for. What are the mitigation steps that FEMA agrees are required under ANR's flood hazard area rule, the FARC rule? A lot of, there are some big numbers tied up in FEMA agreeing that certain mitigation steps are required or not. And, but we do have a major advantage over Irene, where, after Irene, the Waterbury complex was an alternate project. It wasn't a straight line of air and mitigating place. There were, it was a creative project. It was the first of its kind in the country. And after that, so Vermont essentially pushed FEMA to create a new program. So the alternate projects are now a program in FEMA. And we also have an ANR rule that is much more comprehensive and explicit than it was in Irene. So we're in a better negotiating position with FEMA. So we shouldn't experience as much pain dealing with FEMA this time around for this project, but I still anticipate there will be significant disagreements with money on the table at some point.
We're probably looking at $60 million worth of match money, just doing the math. And, I know you're not allowed to say anything about the budget coming forward, and we're not pushing you to say that, but, I don't really see this committee having to handle too much money other than banking some money again off of Hartford unit to add any contact to that, but I don't see much of the Senate institutions tackling much of those projects this year.
Right.
What do you mean exactly?
Meaning that between with what FEMA has to make decisions, insurance companies have to make decisions, that by the time those decisions are made, we're gonna be into the next election cycle. And so I don't see much of those projects hitting this committee in this year.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and that's fair, Mr. Chair, and I would agree with your thoughts on the timeline. I think we're gonna move as fast as we can, but with FEMA, we can only move so fast or we hurt ourselves. And, I do think will be valuable for this session is agreeing with the House on what is the out of session communication expectation and what, if any, protocol there will be to try to move a project forward outside of the session, outside of the normal capital bill process.
What I was very proud about was, in the off session of, getting hold of the Speaker's office and Chair Emmons and then the Pro Tem's office and, having them tour with us, at least one time so that, when we did, so as we move forward, people tend to forget. I really thought it was important that they did see the magnitude of the damage, so that they didn't think in any way that not only us, the Senate institutions, or even the administration was trying to sensationalize just how much work there was needed to be done. And I hope that cooperation continues, which I thought was very, very important for everybody to see really what was there.
I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Chair. I did not appreciate the damage until I saw it with my own eyes, because it's not a destroyed home, which, you know, we have those as well, right? And you can see that from the outside and you can understand the scope of that. But most of the damage with the pavilion and with 133 were hidden, and there were where you don't see it. And it's an unfortunate time for that particular type of damage with the cost for those items in the market right now. But that, luckily, we're able to work that into our estimate. It's not the cost of replacing what you had, it's the cost of, paying for what would replace it right now, if that makes any sense. I jumbled the words there a little bit, but it's the current cost of materials and not what you paid for it originally.
Are you happy? I know I've asked you this several different times and other meetings that we've had. Are you happy with where you're at, you don't feel like you're getting slowed up, or there's a process that has to get played out? Are you happy where it's at?
So there's a couple different areas. On the individual side, it did take us longer than we would have liked. Capstone really did everything they possibly could to stand up disaster case managers quickly. So for the flood in general, the individual side, we were faster than Irene by quite a bit, but we were still not as fast as we would have liked, particularly going into a Vermont winter. We had some success helping people with heating systems, but I think we're still behind on the human impact of the floods. On the business side, we did the $20 million business emergency gap assistance program, which is more than was done in Irene, and I think more than was done in any previous disaster. There's still a lot of need out there. There was still a massive amount of economic injury, well over $300 million. However, I don't know that the state is going to be able to help with that much, because moving into the public side of things, looking for $60 million of match in a year where our economy is slowing down and our growth in all of our funds is struggling. I don't know that we're really well positioned to provide assistance for those businesses that beyond what we already did, which $20 million is quite a bit of assistance for a state of Vermont size. So that actually brought businesses on par with individuals who received $24 million of assistance through FEMA. They receive almost nothing through FEMA, businesses being the they. So we wanted to bring parity to those two groups. We did that. It's still painful because a lot of individuals lost well above what, if you lost your home, FEMA gave you $40,000, $41,000. And the median cost of a home is well over $400,000 in Vermont now.
We're getting calls right now from, I've got 3 of them that I'm working on, not even in my areas. I've reached out to the senators that impacted the area, but we're getting calls not only from this flash storm, but even from the windstorms that we just had, where people are really starting to realize how poor their insurance was compared to these natural disasters, and never even understanding understanding in any way that, that they would have such tremendous wind damage and driveways, flooded out, or longer driveways, and, they're kind of at a loss. They're kind of in a limbo as far as what they can do, and there isn't much out there for them. There is some real hurt out there.
There is. I grew up on a property with a 500-foot driveway in Marshfield, Vermont. And we have private driveways have been an issue since the flood. I do think they are an issue for the state. I do think there is a slight moral hazard in going in and helping people with their private driveways, particularly if they made a choice to have an extremely long driveway. However, that's hard to say when you have a public safety and a health issue where you have someone in that home who's vulnerable, didn't necessarily make the choice to lengthen the driveway, they just live there, right? So it's much more complicated than that, but private driveways are a very difficult issue, and there is very little help out there for people with driveway issues. Private driveways and private bridges, bridges in particular, because they can interfere with emergency vehicles just as much as a driveway, but they're more expensive to repair.
Again, being sensitive to not trying to get you to divulge anything of the budget that we're gonna see before too long. And having conversations with the pro town, very informal conversations that we might have to take some bites out of scheduling dollars in subsequent capital bills. How good is FEMA with us, giving us time to raise this match money before we start spending funds, before we have to go, or before they start putting some pressure on us?
So, with some of the programs where it was a FEMA outlay and there's a match requirement for that, there is zero tolerance. We have to, when they invoice us, we send them the money or we forfeit our grant agreement with them and have to pay back all of the money. So with
I
those,
say pay those bills.
yes, with those programs, there is little tolerance. Those are mostly in the realm of individual assistance. Those are not these big numbers that we're talking about. Because it's a reimbursement construct, the match means unreimbursed expense. And we have a lot of challenges right now, but the one thing we do have going for us is a reasonably sized cash balance. So for a lot of our emergency spending, the administration authorized the emergency spending, and we're not being put in a financially precarious cash situation because of that. It is eating into our cash balances, the 10% that we aren't likely to receive back from FEMA. And we are, between the VA and the budget, I know that, identifying that match and a mechanism for supporting that match will be part of our construct, but with the unreimbursed match, it's mostly about authorization to spend. And with emergency measures, we've gone forward with that, but with any of the bigger projects and the bigger repairs, we've not started any of those. We wouldn't start those projects. We wouldn't start really spending in earnest until we have legislative authorization. So I think the match is partly just making sure we have that authorization to proceed.
Yeah, okay. $150 million in roads, we understand that, and then the rest of being on state buildings. Are most of the damaged buildings within the site of the Capitol, for the most part?
Yes, one clarification, Mr. Chair, the 200 million or so of that 570 million is municipal damage.
Yeah, okay.
So we would, through the Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, we would pay approximately half of that. So there's 20 million of municipal match. We're on the hook for 10 million of that based on our rule that's out there and the expectation that we've established. Municipalities have to front that entire 20 million. And then when the project's finished, then we reimburse them under the rule. So, there's been a lot of press about the cash flow issues and the struggle they're having there. So that is certainly an element of it. And then so 37 million roughly for the straight damage repair mitigation match. That's the rough estimate right now. But then we have our portion of buyouts and hazard mitigation that will be authorized from this event. We are going to be we have been awarded $40 million of money for buyouts and elevations. And so I'm sharing this mostly in the realm of other pressures that are directly related. We would have to come up with $13 million of match to fully utilize that $40 million. And then because of the size of our overall disaster, we're gonna get roughly 80 million of hazard mitigation funds, which would require approximately 20 million of match. So that would be $100 million of hazard mitigation projects. After Irene, we did a little over $36 million of hazard mitigation. So even with inflation, we're looking at a much larger round of mitigation work than we did after Irene.
Yeah.
So that's great. So that's like floodplain restoration, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Okay. So we will get that money, right? It sounded as if it was a maybe.
So here's the challenge, right? With the 40 million, we were awarded that, but we have to present projects that meet FEMA's pretty strict criteria on repetitive damage for the 40 million. So we know we're submitting projects for that, and we know we'll utilize some of that. We're going to try to pull down all of that 40 million. But because the criteria are somewhat narrow, we may not be able to leverage all 40 million. The 80 million, which with our match becomes 100 million of hazard mitigation, there's a longer time frame on that, and that can do buyouts, it can do floodplain mitigation, it can be used for a much broader range of things. The timeline for that is one of the harder deadlines is at the end of this calendar year. After Irene, we asked for multiple extensions and we got them. Thanks to the congressional delegation on the last one, we had to really push. It took us 3 years to get all of our hazard mitigation projects lined up after Irene.
Right, they're complicated.
They're complicated. We're already moving much faster, but it is.
Well, we have to be professionals at it.
Yeah,
So,
unfortunately, yeah.
so that's interesting. So just I'm very interested in stormwater utilities as a way for towns to be able to generate some revenue as matches for other things, but similar. So are you in conversation with towns already about mitigation projects, specific mitigation projects?
We certainly have been with specific towns. Stephanie Smith is the hazard mitigation officer in DEM. She's been working with towns flat out since the disaster. But the regional recovery officers underneath me are going to be organizing regional conversations with groups of towns to try to start that floodplain conversation. ANR is, working on the data for the river corridors itself. But we also have to, really pin down, okay, which communities are willing to work together on these things? Because in almost all of those situations, something done in one town isn't really for the benefit of that town.
Right.
It's for someone else in the corridor.
Right.
So trying to get those more comprehensive plans of how we can work together as groups of towns. I think one thing I've been harping on a little bit is that the disaster was made massively worse by our lack of housing stock, massively worse on the human context, much worse than it needed to be. But one reason we don't see some of these more complex regional projects moving forward is that we don't have a regional structure in Vermont. We go straight from the state to the local.
Right.
Regional planning commissions do everything they can to support the planning process and provide technical expertise, but they're not government and they're not accountable. They're accountable to their board of directors inside their towns in a certain context, but they're not accountable to voters. And I do think, I've been working with Senate GovOps, and I think the administration is definitely supportive of examining our regional structure, and we're trying to secure funds from EDA, Economic Development Authority, and FEMA to see if we can get some federal support for doing this study, perhaps with UVM, to really pull people together and talk about, in the current operating environment of Vermont, the environment that we have to deal with, the changing climate, what is the right structure to help us continue to protect our citizens and our property? And because the state of Vermont, we can't keep people on staff to send to every town in Vermont. It's just not reasonable.
Right.
It would be far too expensive. And in many towns, the size of those towns, the grand list and the population of those towns doesn't merit a full gamut of professional staff. So they just don't have access to many of those services right now. And we tried to do a stopgap measure with the municipal technical assistance program, which was put on pause for a couple months because of the flood and my reappointment in a different role. And that's helping to fill some of that gap. But I think there still is a gap on the decision-making side at the regional level where, you know, I do think it's important for communities to work together, and it's a challenge. It's really hard to take the time, especially for communities that are primarily volunteers.
Right. Right. One thing the bill does is it incentivizes groups of towns to work together to at least maintain these or establish the stormwater utilities. Is the state looking at river corridor management? Because that seems to me to be a good use of state resources, is to manage those corridors, because I think they're mapped now. We're talking about this economic development.
Yes, and I know there are discussions with Senate Natural Resources because some of the elements that Senator Ray is trying to push forward. One area to focus on there is perhaps a minimum standard or uniform standards for the flood hazard rules,
Mhm.
which, as long as we're not draconian with that, it could really benefit builders, it could benefit our residents to have consistency and predictability in how flood hazard like requirements are applied. Right now, the state cannot say, well, this is how, if someone calls and said, I was flooded, I need to know how I should repair my property. The state can only say, you have to go talk to your town floodplain administrator because we don't have control over their floodplains. I'm not suggesting that the state take over that work, but if it was all standardized, the state could at least say, these are the uniform standards and your town is listed as one that follows the uniform standards. So this is what you would need to do.
Mhm.
The damage assessment and the formal ruling on whether or not that was a substantially damaged property would still happen at the local level. But at least if we had uniform standards, a builder could know before going into a community, oh, this is how I could prepare for that project without having to research a specific town's rules.
Right.
Do we know how much housing stock was lost that's not gonna come back online?
So there was at least 260 properties that were substantially damaged or destroyed that were owned by the residents of those homes. If you take our general rental rates for most of the communities, they come out to around 50%. So really back in the napkin is that around 500 homes, residential homes, were damaged or destroyed to the point where they shouldn't be reoccupied. We have had over 200 inquiries, and that's stale, so there's probably more than that now, but in buyouts, people interested in buyouts, buyouts of rental properties are much more complicated. One thing I noticed during this process is that FEMA looks at rental properties just as a business. And yes, they're a business, but they're also places where people live.
Right.
And when we don't have anywhere for those people to go, it's a problem when those rental properties aren't repaired. And the landlords are on their own basically for repairing them. And I apologize if I'm going too long. I don't know exactly how much time I have.
You're good. We're about ready to wrap this up. We've kept you long enough and you're doing fine. So. Anything?
Just one other question.
Yeah.
Isn't there a rainy day fund? Or I've heard of,
Well, we do have, the rainy day fund, the.
and is it just called that, the rainy day fund?
I think we generally call it that. Yeah, we have our standard reserves. Our reserves, if you look at it from a financial health perspective, we're really not in a position where we could dip into our reserves without endangering our financial, our bond rating status. So yes, we have reserves, but until we're willing to jeopardize our bond rating, we probably can't practically access them.
Yeah, and it's pretty scary right now because we don't really know what this economy is gonna do. I mean, I know in transportation already, we're seeing revenues really kind of diminishing faster than what we really thought they were going to. And that bond rating, as we know in this committee here, I mean, that's what kind of why we have the cash fund going, is because we are able to borrow less and less and less. But our needs, as far as, maintenance and other things that this committee handles, those are going up and up and up. So, yeah, I mean, be careful with that bond rating, or we'll be all cash, and we're not prepared to do that. No, we're not. So, yeah, so, any more questions? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Doug, we talked a little bit about, I guess, lessons learned from Irene. And the Waterbury complex, if you will. I don't know who sort of ramrodded that whole thing, but I'm hoping that if that person's still around, that we would take advantage of the lessons that we did learn in terms of the Capitol complex, but maybe somewhere else in the state as well. I mean, BGS did a tremendous job, getting us where we are right now. And they were definitely an integral part of what happened in Waterbury after Irene. So I'm just hoping that we are focused on those kinds of lessons that, because what would you say, $200 to damage from July? That's incredible.
Yeah, it was, the pictures were like startling, right? It was completely surrounded by water, but it was undamaged.
Yeah.
The DMV had a much more modest flood mitigation project performed a couple of years ago, and it held up extremely well. Had what I would consider minimal damage. Some water got in because one pump wasn't functioning quite right. If that pump had been maintained properly, or actually, that was a poor way to phrase it, but if that pump hadn't been
If
broken,
that pump hadn't failed, because one time what we told her in DMV was that it just had disconnected, and so it was pumping water doing what it was supposed to do, but the pipe had disconnected, so it wasn't getting to where it needed to do, so it was just circulating.
yeah. And we do have, so one thing that, I guess the benefit of having several major disasters in a row is that we had a contract with Guidehouse for surge capacity for disaster support. And so they are helping us with our FEMA process. And part of that is one of the individuals that was involved with the Waterbury complex and figuring out the technical aspects of how to make that happen was Thad Lugamores, and he's contracting with us to help us do that.
Yeah.
So we are and we do plan to present several options to the legislature about how to approach the Capitol complex. Of course, that's really down to, the BGS will work with the architects. The governor will have some say on the direction there. It'll be presented in the legislature. There'll be some back and forth, right? Personally, I find the Waterbury complex, the architecture was a bit ambitious. I don't think we need to change the architectural nature of the buildings in Montpelier that much. I think this should be more about protecting the mechanical to find the most
Flood
low key way, the most practical way to achieve what we did in Waterbury, but, yeah. It's a little bit of my bias showing there, but,
Well, it's historic preservation too.
yeah,
Yeah, and there's a really good floodplain in Brattleboro that
yes,
was built, and we brought
functions.
a lot of
extremely well.
folks down, and in December, it worked really well too. I guess December didn't rise to the level of a statewide.
No, but I mean, we still had 500-year levels in some
Yeah.
places in the state in December.
We
And my
brought-
basement flooded in December.
Yeah, my office, one of my offices did, and it did in Irene, it didn't in the July floods, but it did in December floods, yeah, so, yeah. Any more questions for Mr. Parham? Well, thank you for what you're doing. You're a busy guy. We were just talking about, you seem to be the Mr. Fix-It guy in government. You've been in a lot of different places, and we're very lucky to have you in this role. Appreciate all of the times that you and I have talked, either, not one-on-one, but in several meetings I've been in with you, and always find you to be very accommodating and accurate and helpful with the information that you provide. And thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I do like solving problems, and unfortunately, we never run out of those.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming in. Okay, committee, we're gonna have a few little minutes here. We might as well just go off just for a minute.